the air in New Orleans hung thick and sweet on the evening of May 15, 1852, carrying the mingled scents of magnolia blossoms, river mud, and something darker that most of the city's privileged class chose never to acknowledge. The Mississippi rolled past the elegant estates of the Garden District, its brown waters holding secrets that would never surface, while inside the magnificent Dufresne mansion, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls papered in silk imported from Paris. 12 members of New Orleans' most prestigious merchant families had gathered to celebrate a union that promised to consolidate fortunes and secure futures built on the backs of human property. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Within 3 hours, every adult present would be dead, their final moments spent in an agony that no doctor could explain and no priest could ease. The newspapers would call it a mysterious illness, perhaps contaminated shellfish or a sudden plague sent by divine providence. What they would never report, what the authorities would desperately try to suppress, was that the architect of this mass execution was a 16-year-old girl who had spent 7 months perfecting her recipe for justice. Her name was Delphine, and she had learned from her murdered mother that sometimes the sweetest revenge is served on fine china, hidden inside a wedding cake that guests would praise even as it killed them. This is the story of how a laundress's daughter transformed grief into purpose, sorrow into strategy, and a traditional Creole wedding dessert into a death sentence that would haunt New Orleans society for generations. The Garden District of New Orleans in 1851 existed as a world unto itself, separated from the rest of the city not merely by geography but by an invisible wall of wealth and privilege that proved more impenetrable than any physical barrier. Greek Revival mansions lined streets shaded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, their manicured gardens bursting with roses, camellias, and oleander bushes whose beautiful pink flowers concealed a deadly secret. Behind these grand facades lived families whose fortunes had been built through sugar plantations, cotton trading, and the commerce that flowed endlessly along the Mississippi River. The Beaumont family occupied one of the district's finest addresses, a 3-story mansion with elaborate wrought iron balconies that had been forged by enslaved craftsmen whose names were never recorded. Augustine Beaumont had arrived in New Orleans 20 years earlier with little more than ambition and a talent for recognizing profitable opportunities. Through calculated investments in river commerce and strategic partnerships with plantation owners upriver, he had transformed himself from a struggling merchant into one of the city's wealthiest traders. His mansion reflected this ascent, filled with furniture from Europe, paintings by fashionable artists, and enough silver to stock a small restaurant. Augustine's wife Camille had brought her own pedigree to the marriage, daughter of an old Creole family whose French ancestry stretched back to the colonial period. She had learned early that maintaining social position required constant vigilance, endless entertaining, and the appearance of effortless superiority. Her drawing room hosted the most sought-after salons in the Garden District, where wealthy women discussed art and literature while carefully managing their husbands' business connections. The Beaumont sons represented 2 different paths to power. Philippe, the eldest at 28, had inherited his father's calculating nature and business acumen. He managed the family's shipping interests with cold efficiency, viewing every interaction as a potential transaction. Victor, for years younger, possessed neither his brother's discipline nor his father's strategic mind. What he did possess was a volatile temperament, a sense of entitlement that knew no bounds, and a cruel streak that manifested whenever he encountered someone who could not fight back. Camille dismissed her younger son's behavior as high spirits, while Augustine saw it as a weakness that needed to be controlled before it damaged the family's reputation. The French Quarter, where most of the city's free people of color and enslaved population lived and worked, existed just a few miles but an entire world away from the Garden District's pristine streets. Here the architecture leaned towards Spanish and French colonial styles, with buildings featuring interior courtyards, street-level shops, and living quarters above. The narrow streets pulsed with life, filled with the sounds of multiple languages, the smells of Creole cooking, and a vibrant culture that mixed African, Caribbean, French, and Spanish influences into something unique to New Orleans. Martha had lived in a small apartment above a bakery on Dauphine Street, sharing the modest space with her husband Isaac, their daughter Delphine, and 8-year-old son Benjamin. She had been born enslaved on a sugar plantation 30 miles upriver but had purchased her freedom 12 years earlier through years of saved wages and her extraordinary skill with a needle. Martha's talent for sewing had become legendary among the city's wealthy families. She could transform imported fabric into gowns that made society matrons feel like European royalty, and her wedding dresses were considered works of art. Brides throughout New Orleans specifically requested her services, willing to wait months for one of Martha's creations. Isaac worked at the Levee District loading and unloading the endless stream of cargo that moved through New Orleans' busy port. The labor was backbreaking and the pay barely sufficient, but it was honest work and he was his own man, not property. Together, he and Martha had built a life that, while modest by the standards of the families Martha sewed for, represented a kind of freedom that most people who looked like them could never dream of achieving. Delphine had inherited her mother's artistic talent and her father's quiet strength. At 15, she already showed signs of surpassing Martha's skill with a needle, her fingers moving with a precision and grace that made even complex embroidery look effortless. Martha had been teaching her daughter not just the technical skills of sewing, but the business of managing clients, calculating costs, and building a reputation. She had dreams of one day opening a proper shop where she and Delphine could work together, creating beautiful things and building something lasting. Benjamin attended a small school run by free people of color in the quarter, one of the few places where black children could learn to read and write. He was bright and curious, always asking questions about how things worked and why the world was organized the way it was. Martha and Isaac had carefully taught both their children to navigate the complex and dangerous world they inhabited, where being free meant something very different depending on the color of your skin. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent, how to show deference without surrendering dignity, and above all, how to recognize danger before it arrived. The Beaumont family had been among Martha's most important clients for 3 years. Camille Beaumont had discovered Martha through a friend's recommendation and had been immediately impressed by the quality of her work. Martha had sewn dozens of dresses for Camille and her social circle, each one reinforcing her reputation as the finest seamstress in New Orleans. The arrangement had been mutually beneficial. Camille gained access to custom clothing that set her apart from her peers, while Martha received steady work at prices that allowed her family to live comfortably. Delphine often accompanied her mother on fittings at the Beaumont mansion, carrying supplies and learning the delicate art of managing wealthy clients who believed their money bought them the right to treat working people as interchangeable servants. Martha had taught her to smile politely while wealthy women made impossible demands, to accept criticism of flawless work without protest, and to always maintain perfect courtesy regardless of how she was treated. It was during these visits that Delphine first noticed Victor Beaumont's attention. At first, it seemed harmless enough, just a young man of the house making small talk while his mother was being fitted. But over the months, his interest had become more persistent, his comments more inappropriate, his presence during fittings less coincidental. Martha had recognized the danger immediately. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She began making excuses to leave Delphine at home, insisting she could manage the fittings alone. When Camille questioned why the talented young assistant no longer accompanied her, Martha invented stories about Delphine working on other projects or attending to her brother. It was a delicate balance, protecting her daughter without insulting the Beaumont family or losing their valuable patronage. Victor's attention, denied its preferred target, had shifted fully to Martha herself. What had begun as entitled flirtation evolved into something darker and more insistent. He began appearing in the sewing room where Martha worked during extended fittings, making comments that grew progressively more explicit. Martha handled these encounters with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood that her freedom existed only at the pleasure of people like the Beaumonts, that any direct rejection could cost her everything she had built. She deflected, redirected, and maintained professional boundaries while never openly acknowledging what Victor was actually proposing. For months, this uneasy dynamic had continued. Victor pushed boundaries while Martha carefully retreated, maintaining just enough distance to preserve her dignity while not provoking a confrontation that could destroy her business and possibly her freedom. She never told Isaac about these encounters, knowing that his protective instincts might lead him to confront Victor in a way that would end with Isaac in chains or worse. She never told Delphine either, not wanting to burden her daughter with fears she could do nothing about. Tante Josephine lived in a weathered cottage near Bayou St. John, on the uncertain boundary between the city proper and the wild wetlands that surrounded New Orleans. She was ancient by anyone's reckoning, though no one knew her exact age, and she carried knowledge that stretched back through generations to Africa itself. The neighborhood children both feared and respected her, whispering that she could cure any illness, curse any enemy, and see futures that hadn't yet arrived. Tante Josephine was a root worker, a practitioner of the folk medicine and spiritual traditions that had traveled across the ocean in the memories of enslaved people and evolved in the unique cultural mixture of New Orleans. She knew which plants could heal and which could harm, which roots could induce sleep and which could stop a heart. She understood the properties of every herb that grew in Louisiana's swamps and forests, and she maintained a garden behind her cottage where carefully cultivated specimens grew under her watchful eye. Among the healing herbs and useful vegetables grew other plants, oleander with its beautiful deadly flowers, jimsonweed with its trumpet-shaped blooms and poisonous seeds, foxglove whose lovely purple flowers contained compounds that could stop a heart or cure it depending on the dose. Martha had known Tante Josephine since childhood, having met her on the plantation where Martha was born. The old woman had been the unofficial healer for the enslaved community, treating injuries and illnesses that plantation owners considered too minor to warrant calling an expensive doctor. She had also been a keeper of older knowledge, teaching young people about their heritage and the spiritual traditions that survived despite every effort to erase them. When Martha purchased her freedom and moved to New Orleans, she had been delighted to discover that Tante Josephine had also made her way to the city years earlier. The two women had maintained their connection, with Martha visiting the cottage regularly, sometimes bringing Delphine along. Tante Josephine had watched Delphine grow from a curious child into a thoughtful young woman, recognizing in her the same intelligence and strength she had seen in Martha. She had begun teaching Delphine about plants, starting with the medicinal ones, explaining which leaves could reduce fever, which roots could ease pain, which flowers could help with sleep. Delphine had proven an eager student, her careful attention to detail and excellent memory making her a natural herbalist. October had arrived in New Orleans with its promise of relief from the brutal summer heat, the air finally cooling to temperatures that made movement possible without drowning in sweat. Martha had received a summons from Camille Beaumont requesting a fitting for a new series of dresses for the upcoming social season. She had left home early that morning, her arms filled with fabric samples and her notebook containing detailed measurements and sketches. Isaac had already departed for the docks, and Delphine was preparing to take Benjamin to school before beginning work on a christening gown for a client in the quarter. Martha had promised to return by afternoon, planning to pick up fresh fish from the market for dinner. When she didn't arrive home by dark, Delphine felt the first stirrings of worry but told herself that fittings sometimes ran long, that wealthy women liked to talk and paid for the privilege of a seamstress's time. When midnight arrived and Martha still hadn't returned, Delphine's worry transformed into something sharper and more frightening. Isaac returned from a late shift at the docks to find his daughter sitting by the window, unable to sleep until she knew her mother was safe. They learned the truth the next morning when a police officer appeared at their door with news delivered in a tone that suggested he was doing them a favor by informing them at all. Martha had died the previous evening at the Beaumont mansion, the result of a tragic accident. According to the official report, she had been descending the grand staircase when she lost her footing and fell, striking her head on the marble floor. Death had been instantaneous. Augustine Beaumont had expressed his condolences and offered to cover funeral expenses as a gesture of goodwill. The officer made it clear that no investigation would be necessary, that accidents happened, that the Beaumonts were respected members of the community who had been nothing but generous to Martha over the years. Delphine heard the words but they made no sense. Her mother had climbed stairs her entire life, had navigated the Beaumont mansion dozens of times, had never been clumsy or careless. Something about this story felt wrong, felt incomplete, felt like a lie told by people who knew no one would question them. Isaac received the news in stunned silence, his face collapsing into an expression of loss so profound that Delphine felt her own grief multiply at the sight of it. Within hours, the entire French Quarter knew about Martha's death, the news spreading through the network of free people of color and enslaved workers who understood that when one of their own died in a wealthy white household, the official story was rarely the whole truth. It was old Jerome who finally told Delphine the truth 3 days after they buried Martha in the cemetery reserved for free people of color on the edge of the city. Jerome had worked in the Beaumont household for 40 years, brought there as a young man and now so elderly that even Augustine Beaumont no longer saw him as having any economic value. He had been relegated to light duties, polishing silver and tending the garden, tasks that kept him present but invisible in the way that old enslaved people often became to those who owned them. Jerome had been in the garden outside the main house on the evening Martha died, pruning the oleander bushes that Camille loved despite their poisonous nature. Through the tall windows, he had witnessed what truly happened on that grand staircase, and the knowledge had been eating at him like a cancer ever since. He found Delphine in the market 3 days after the funeral, pretending to examine vegetables while actually working up the courage to approach her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd to see who might be listening. He told her to meet him at Congo Square after dark, in the area where people gathered for the Sunday dances and celebrations, where their conversation might be lost among the crowds and the noise. Delphine arrived as the sun was setting, her heart hammering in her chest with a mixture of hope and dread. She had known something was wrong with the official story, but part of her had feared discovering the truth, feared that knowing might make the grief unbearable. Jerome appeared from the shadows like a ghost, his weathered face creased with lines of sorrow and guilt. He told her everything in a rush of words, as if keeping the secret any longer might kill him before old age did. Martha had indeed been at the top of the grand staircase that evening, he explained, but she had not been alone. Victor Beaumont had cornered her there after his mother had finished the fitting and retired to her chambers. Jerome had been able to hear raised voices through the open windows as he worked in the garden below. Victor had been making demands, had been insistent that Martha show him the gratitude he felt he deserved for his family's patronage. Martha had refused, her voice firm and clear even through the window glass. She had told him that she was a free woman, not his property, that she would continue to work for his mother but that his behavior was inappropriate and needed to stop. The rejection had enraged Victor in a way that Jerome said he had seen before in young men raised to believe the world existed solely for their pleasure. There had been more shouting, though Jerome could not make out all the words. Then he had seen through the window as Victor grabbed Martha's arm, saw her pull away, saw the flash of anger on Victor's face. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jerome said he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Victor had placed both hands on Martha's shoulders and pushed, a violent shove that sent her tumbling backward down the marble staircase. The sound of her body striking the steps had been audible even in the garden, a series of terrible thuds that ended with a final, awful crack as her head met the floor at the bottom. Jerome had dropped his pruning shears and rushed toward the house, but by the time he reached the entrance, Augustine and Camille had already appeared, summoned by the noise. Victor had been standing at the top of the stairs, his face pale but his voice steady as he explained what had happened. Martha had lost her footing, he said. It had been a terrible accident. She had seemed dizzy, perhaps had been working too hard in the heat. He had tried to catch her but had been too far away. His parents had accepted this story without question, perhaps because they wanted to believe it, perhaps because questioning it would have meant acknowledging something too dark about their own son. The police had been summoned as a formality, but everyone involved understood that no real investigation would occur. Martha was a free black woman who had died in a white household. The household was well respected, the family beyond reproach. Case closed. Jerome had kept silent because speaking would have accomplished nothing except getting himself sold away or worse. No one would believe an elderly enslaved man over the son of one of New Orleans' wealthiest merchants. But the guilt had been consuming him, and when he saw Delphine in the market, young and grieving and searching for answers, he could no longer keep the truth to himself. He told her he understood if she hated him for his silence, that he hated himself for it. Then he melted back into the darkness before she could respond, before she could thank him or curse him or ask him any of the 1,000 questions suddenly burning in her mind. Delphine stood alone in Congo Square as night fell completely over New Orleans, the truth settling over her like a shroud. Her mother had not died in an accident. She had been murdered for the crime of refusing a wealthy man's advances, for daring to assert her humanity and her right to say no. Victor Beaumont had killed her and suffered no consequences beyond having to maintain a lie, and the entire structure of society had conspired to protect him from any accountability. The grief that had consumed Delphine for the past 3 days transformed in that moment into something sharper and colder. She thought about her mother's careful lessons in navigating a world that saw them as less than human, about her father's quiet warnings to never give powerful people an excuse to hurt them, about all the compromises and concessions and careful diplomacy required just to survive. Martha had done everything right. She had been respectful and professional. She had purchased her freedom and built a legitimate business. She had never challenged the social order or demanded equality. And none of it had mattered. Victor Beaumont had taken her life as casually as someone might swat a mosquito, and the world had shrugged and moved on. Delphine walked home through the dark streets of the French Quarter with a new clarity settling over her thoughts. She understood now that there was no justice to be found through official channels, no protection under laws that were never written with people like her in mind. If Victor Beaumont was going to pay for what he had done, she would have to be the one to make him pay. She would have to become something other than a grieving daughter. She would have to become an instrument of justice in a world that offered none. When she arrived home, she found Isaac sitting at their small table, a bottle of cheap rum in front of him and tears running silently down his face. He looked up when she entered, and she saw in his eyes that he too had begun to suspect the truth, even without Jerome's testimony. A man did not live as long as Isaac had in their world without understanding how these things worked, without recognizing the patterns of wealthy men and the women who disappeared after rejecting them. Delphine sat down across from her father and took his hands in hers. She did not tell him about Jerome, did not share the specific details of what she now knew. Instead, she made him a promise that she would later realize was the moment she stopped being a child and became something else entirely. She promised him that Martha would be honored, that her death would not be forgotten, that there would be an accounting. Isaac looked at his daughter with fear dawning in his eyes, because he heard in her voice something that terrified him more than his own grief. He heard determination and purpose and a cold certainty that reminded him of stories his own grandmother had told him about women who had made similar promises, women who had chosen justice over survival and had paid terrible prices for that choice. He tried to tell her that revenge would only get her killed or enslaved, that the world did not work the way she wanted it to, that sometimes swallowing injustice was the only way to survive. But Delphine was no longer listening to wisdom about survival. Her mother had survived for 38 years by following all those rules, and in the end it had not saved her. Delphine had no interest in growing old by accepting the unacceptable. She had other plans entirely. Over the next several days, Delphine began visiting Tante Josephine with a frequency and intensity that worried Isaac but that he felt powerless to prevent. The old woman's cottage near Bayou St. John became Delphine's second home, and what transpired there during those long afternoons and evenings would transform the young seamstress into something far more dangerous. Tante Josephine had heard about Martha's death through the network of people who shared information beneath the notice of those who thought themselves important. She had known Martha well, had loved her like a daughter, and when Delphine appeared at her door with eyes full of purpose instead of just grief, the old woman understood immediately what the girl wanted. Some might have turned her away, might have counseled patience or acceptance or leaving justice to divine providence. Tante Josephine was not one of those people. She had lived too long and seen too much injustice to believe that the universe corrected itself without human intervention. She had watched countless women like Martha be used and discarded by men who faced no consequences for their actions. She had delivered babies conceived in rape and tended women beaten for refusing advances and buried victims of violence that was never investigated. If this young woman wanted to learn how to fight back, wanted to transform grief into power, Tante Josephine would teach her. But she would teach her properly, with full knowledge of what she was choosing and what it would cost. The lessons began simply enough, reviewing the medicinal herbs that Delphine already knew from previous visits. But gradually, Tante Josephine introduced other plants, ones she had never mentioned before. She showed Delphine the oleander bush growing in her own garden, explained how every part of the plant contained cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart in high enough doses. She crushed the leaves and showed the milky sap, explained how it could be dried and powdered and hidden in food where it would dissolve and become undetectable. She walked with Delphine into the bayou itself, pointing out jimsonweed growing wild along the water's edge, its trumpet-shaped flowers beautiful and deadly. She explained how the seeds contained tropane alkaloids that caused confusion, hallucinations, and eventually respiratory failure. She taught Delphine how to recognize the difference between jimsonweed and similar-looking but harmless plants, how to harvest the seeds at the right stage of maturity, how to process them to concentrate their effects. They collected foxglove from a secret spot where it grew in the shade of cypress trees, and Tante Josephine explained the dangerous precision required to use it effectively. Too little and it would have no effect. Too much and it would cause immediate violent illness that would be obviously poisoning. But the right amount, carefully calculated based on body weight and health, could cause a heart to beat irregularly and then stop, leaving doctors baffled by what appeared to be natural cardiac failure. Each plant came with detailed instructions about harvesting, processing, storage, and dosage. Tante Josephine had notebooks filled with observations accumulated over decades, passed down from other root workers who had themselves learned from enslaved healers who could never write anything down but who memorized everything perfectly. She showed these notebooks to Delphine, explained the careful notations about which plants worked best in combination, how to mask bitter flavors with sweet ones, how to account for differences in individual tolerance. But beyond the technical knowledge, Tante Josephine taught Delphine something even more important. She taught her patience. Rushing toward revenge would only get her caught and killed, the old woman explained. If Delphine wanted to succeed, she needed to think like someone playing a long game, someone willing to wait for exactly the right moment when all the pieces aligned. She needed to become invisible in the way that people like them had learned to become invisible, blending into the background while remaining perfectly aware of everything happening around them. She needed to watch and learn and prepare, and only strike when the opportunity presented itself in a way that would give her both justice and escape. Delphine proved to be an exceptional student, bringing to these dark lessons the same careful attention to detail that had made her a skilled seamstress. She took her own notes in a small journal that she kept hidden in her room, recording not just the technical information about plants and dosages but also her observations about the Beaumont family and their social circle. She began paying close attention to gossip in the French Quarter, to the bits of information that came through the network of people who worked in wealthy households and shared news over back fences and in market stalls. She learned that Victor Beaumont had become engaged to Evangeline Dufresne, daughter of Jacques Dufresne, who owned a shipping company that controlled much of the cargo trade through the port of New Orleans. The engagement had been announced just 2 weeks after Martha's death, which Delphine found grimly appropriate. Victor had killed her mother and moved on with his life without a moment's hesitation, without any consequences beyond having to remember his lie. She learned that the wedding was planned for mid-May, 5 months away, giving her time to prepare. She discovered that it would be a relatively small ceremony followed by an intimate dinner for just the immediate families and a few close relatives. Perfect. She began cultivating a plan that was ambitious and terrifying and had almost no chance of success, but which felt like the only possible response to the magnitude of what had been done to her mother. Through the winter months of early 1852, as New Orleans experienced its brief cold season and Mardi Gras celebrations swept through the streets, Delphine lived a double life. During the day, she maintained her mother's sewing business, taking on clients and producing work that maintained Martha's reputation for excellence. She cared for Benjamin, making sure he continued attending school and remained unaware of what had really happened to their mother. She comforted Isaac when his grief overwhelmed him in the evenings, holding him while he wept for the woman he had loved since they were both young. But at night, after Benjamin and Isaac had fallen asleep, Delphine transformed into someone else entirely. She studied Tante Josephine's notebooks by candlelight, memorizing dosages and effects and combinations. She practiced identifying plants from dried samples, learning to recognize them by smell and texture when visual identification was impossible. She began making careful expeditions to the Bayou St. John in the darkness before dawn, collecting specimens and bringing them back to dry and process in secret. She transformed a corner of the small storage area behind their apartment into a hidden laboratory, carefully organizing her collected plants and preparing them according to Tante Josephine's instructions. The work required precision and patience. Leaves had to be dried at exactly the right speed to preserve their potency. Seeds needed to be processed within specific time frames to maximize their concentration of active compounds. Everything had to be stored properly to prevent degradation or accidental exposure. Delphine discovered that she had a natural aptitude for this work, that the same qualities that made her an excellent seamstress translated perfectly to the careful measurements and precise timing required for preparing plant extracts. Her hands were steady, her attention to detail obsessive, and her motivation absolute. She also began paying attention to food, specifically to baking and pastry making. Martha had been an adequate cook but had never specialized in desserts. Delphine decided she needed to become expert in this area, because the plan forming in her mind required that she be able to create something so delicious, so perfect, that no one would question its safety even for a moment. She began experimenting with recipes for cakes and pastries, buying ingredients with the money she earned from sewing and practicing late into the night. She discovered that she had inherited her mother's talent for creating beautiful things, that the artistic sensibility that allowed her to envision and execute perfect stitching translated equally well to decorating cakes and forming delicate pastry. She began bringing her experiments to neighbors and clients, soliciting feedback and adjusting her techniques. Word spread through the French Quarter that Martha's daughter had inherited not just her sewing skills but had developed remarkable talent for baking as well. Clients who came for dress fittings began requesting that Delphine also provide desserts for their celebrations. The business expanded naturally, and Delphine encouraged this development, knowing it would be useful when the time came. In March, she received an unexpected opportunity that felt like Providence confirming her plans. Lisette, an enslaved woman who worked in the Beaumont household as a housekeeper, appeared at Delphine's door one evening with a commission. She explained that Camille Beaumont was planning a small celebration for Victor's birthday and wanted to order a special cake. The regular baker they used had disappointed them recently, and Camille had heard through various sources that Martha's daughter had developed considerable skill with desserts. Would Delphine be willing to create something for the occasion? The irony was almost too perfect. Victor Beaumont's mother was requesting that the daughter of the woman he had murdered create a celebratory dessert for him. Delphine felt something close to laughter bubbling up in her throat but managed to maintain her composure. She told Lisette she would be honored to take the commission, that she would create something truly memorable. The birthday celebration took place in early April, and Delphine delivered a cake that drew effusive praise from Camille and her guests. It was a traditional French-style layer cake with buttercream frosting and delicate sugar flowers, beautiful to look at and apparently delicious to eat. Victor consumed 2 large slices, declaring it the best cake he had ever tasted. Delphine had not poisoned it. That would have been too early, too suspicious, too likely to be traced back to her. This was merely a test run, a way to establish herself as a trusted baker for the Beaumont family, to ensure that when the time came, no one would question her products. The test succeeded beyond her expectations. Camille Beaumont was so impressed that she began recommending Delphine to friends, and soon the young woman found herself with more baking commissions than she could easily handle while also maintaining the sewing business. She accepted as many as she could manage, building a reputation as someone whose desserts were not just delicious but were also beautiful works of art suitable for the most elegant celebrations. When news began circulating in April that Victor and Evangeline's wedding would include a traditional Creole wedding cake as centerpiece of the reception dinner, Delphine saw her opportunity arriving. Wedding cakes in New Orleans at that time were not the towering confections that would become popular in later decades. Instead, they tended to follow French and Spanish traditions, often resembling what would later be called king cake, a ring-shaped pastry decorated elaborately and meant to be shared among guests as a symbol of unity and celebration. The tradition held that the baker should be someone connected to either family, someone whose participation represented the community's blessing on the union. Through Lisette, who had become an inadvertent ally by continuing to bring commissions from the Beaumont household, Delphine learned that Evangeline's family was struggling to find a suitable baker. The woman who had originally been commissioned had fallen ill, and time was running short. Camille had suggested Delphine based on her excellent work for Victor's birthday. Would she be interested in such an important commission? Delphine allowed herself to appear hesitant, concerned about whether she was experienced enough for such an important event. This hesitation made her seem more trustworthy, more genuine, and ultimately more appealing to families who wanted someone humble and grateful for the opportunity. When she finally accepted, expressing gratitude for the honor, both families were delighted. The young seamstress who had learned her craft from the late Martha would create the centerpiece dessert for the wedding that would unite two of New Orleans' most prominent merchant families. No one thought to question why a young black woman might have mixed feelings about this commission. No one considered that she might have motivations beyond the generous payment being offered. They saw only what they expected to see, a talented young woman grateful for the opportunity to serve her betters. The commission to create the wedding cake arrived with specifications that revealed just how carefully the Beaumont and Dufresne families were orchestrating every detail of the celebration that would unite their fortunes. Evangeline wanted a traditional Creole-style ring cake decorated with candied flowers and glazed fruits, large enough to serve 12 guests with generous portions that symbolized abundance and prosperity. The cake needed to incorporate ingredients that reflected New Orleans' unique culinary heritage, including cane sugar from local plantations, pecans from Louisiana groves, and rum that had traveled up the Mississippi from Caribbean islands. Camille Beaumont added her own requirements during a meeting at the mansion where Delphine was summoned to discuss the details. The older woman received her in the same elegant parlor where Martha had once measured her for gowns, and Delphine felt her mother's ghost hovering in every corner of the ornate room. Camille wanted the cake to include orange blossom water, a traditional ingredient in French wedding desserts that symbolized purity and new beginnings. She requested that the decorations incorporate the Beaumont family colors of cream and gold, and that the presentation be elegant enough to complement the elaborate table settings that had been imported from France specifically for the occasion. Delphine listened carefully to every requirement, taking detailed notes in the same small journal where she had been recording very different kinds of information over the past months. She asked thoughtful questions about flavor preferences and dietary restrictions, playing the role of the conscientious artisan perfectly. She learned that Victor preferred bourbon to brandy, that Evangeline had a weakness for candied violets, that Jacques Dufresne suffered from gout and needed to avoid certain rich foods but would make an exception for wedding cake. Each piece of information was filed away, not just for creating an appealing dessert but for the darker purpose that no one in that elegant parlor could have imagined. When Victor himself appeared during the consultation, Delphine experienced a moment of such intense rage that she feared it might show on her face. This was the man who had murdered her mother, who had pushed Martha down a marble staircase and then lied about it without a trace of remorse. He stood in the doorway smiling, commenting on how talented she must be to have earned such an important commission, how her mother would surely be proud. The casual mention of Martha, spoken as if Victor had any right to invoke her memory, nearly broke Delphine's careful composure. But she had spent months preparing for moments exactly like this, learning to separate her true feelings from the mask she showed the world. She smiled politely and thanked him for his kind words, her voice steady and appropriately grateful. She watched him taste a sample of the cake she had brought, watched him close his eyes in pleasure at the flavors, watched him lick buttercream from his fingers with the unself-conscious satisfaction of someone who had never faced consequences for anything. She memorized his face in that moment, storing the image away for the nights when doubt might creep in, when the enormity of what she was planning might seem too frightening to execute. That evening, back in the safety of her apartment with the door locked and Benjamin asleep in the other room, Delphine allowed herself to feel the full force of her hatred. She sat at the small table where her family had once shared meals, where Martha had taught her the first stitches of embroidery, where they had dreamed together about the shop they would someday open. She let the tears come, not tears of grief now but tears of pure fury at the injustice of a world where men like Victor Beaumont could kill without consequence while people like her mother lived every moment aware that one wrong word, one failed deflection, could cost them everything. When the tears finally stopped, Delphine felt something settle inside her, a cold clarity that would sustain her through what came next. She was going to kill Victor Beaumont and everyone who would gather to celebrate his wedding. She was going to make them pay not just for Martha's death but for the entire system that had made such a death possible and meaningless. The wedding was scheduled for May 15th, which gave Delphine 5 weeks to perfect her recipe in both its conventional and modified forms. She began by creating a base recipe that would be delicious enough to justify her reputation, complex enough to mask any additional flavors, and structured in a way that would allow her to incorporate her special ingredients without changing the texture or appearance in any noticeable way. The foundation would be a rich butter cake flavored with vanilla, almond extract, and orange blossom water. She would soak the layers in a rum syrup that added moisture and complementary flavor while also providing additional masking for bitter compounds. The filling would incorporate candied fruits and pecans bound together with a butter-based cream that could hide a multitude of sins. The exterior would be covered in a smooth fondant glaze, decorated with candied flowers and gold leaf that would distract from any irregularities in the cake itself. She tested this base recipe multiple times, bringing versions to clients and neighbors, soliciting detailed feedback about flavor, texture, and appearance. Each test helped her refine the recipe while also establishing a trail of innocent cakes, proof that her creations were consistently safe and delicious. She needed people to expect excellence from her desserts, to anticipate pleasure rather than suspicion when they saw one of her cakes arrive. Simultaneously, she began experimenting with her special ingredients under Tante Josephine's careful supervision. The challenge was to create something that would be reliably lethal to all 12 adult guests while remaining completely undetectable in taste, smell, and appearance. This required a careful combination of multiple plant extracts, each chosen for specific properties that would work together to ensure no one survived to tell authorities what had happened. Oleander would form the foundation of her formula, providing the cardiac glycosides that would ultimately stop hearts. But oleander alone had drawbacks, including a bitter taste that could be detected in symptoms that appeared quickly enough that victims might realize they had been poisoned while still able to communicate. Tante Josephine suggested combining the oleander with extracts from white snakeroot, a plant that grew wild in Louisiana and contained trematol, a toxin that caused what frontier settlers had called milk sickness. Trematol poisoned slowly and subtly, causing weakness, vomiting, and eventually death from metabolic acidosis. Crucially, its effects were delayed by several hours, which meant victims would not immediately connect their symptoms to food consumed at dinner. The combination would be devastating. The oleander would affect the heart while the snakeroot poisoned the metabolism, creating a cascade of failures that would overwhelm even the healthiest constitution. But Tante Josephine warned that dosage calculations would be critical. Too much and victims would become violently ill too quickly, potentially allowing doctors to intervene or at least to recognize poisoning had occurred. Too little and some guests might survive, able to identify the cake as the source of their illness. Delphine needed to hit a precise middle range where the poison would work inexorably but slowly enough that by the time symptoms became severe, the toxins would be too deeply embedded in body systems to counteract. They spent weeks calculating dosages based on estimates of each guest's body weight and health status. Victor and his brother Philippe were both young and robust, requiring higher doses. Camille was delicate and frequently ill, needing less. Augustine was heavy-set and dealt with various health complaints, placing him somewhere in the middle. The Dufresne family presented similar variations that needed to be accounted for in Delphine's calculations. She created detailed charts mapping out each guest, their estimated weight, their known health conditions, and the calculated dose they would need to receive to ensure death within 12 to 18 hours of consumption. The technical challenge of incorporating these calculated doses into individual servings of a shared cake seemed initially insurmountable, but Delphine devised an elegant solution. She would create the cake as a ring with 12 distinct sections, each one slightly different in its decoration so she could track which piece went to which guest. She would inject the poison directly into each section using a method borrowed from her sewing work, a large needle similar to those used for upholstery, hollow at the center, that could be inserted into cake and would deliver liquid extract deep into the crumb where it would disperse evenly. Each section would receive its calculated dose, and she would create a detailed map showing which decorated section corresponded to which guest. She would insist on personally serving the cake, explaining this as traditional and appropriate given the honor of having created it. No one would question this request. It would seem like reasonable pride in her work, perhaps even charmingly humble. They would never imagine that she needed to control the serving to ensure each guest received their specific death sentence. The serving plan required her to memorize the seating arrangement, which she obtained through Lisette, who had access to Camille's planning documents. Victor and Evangeline would sit at the center of the table as guests of honor. To Victor's right would be his parents, then Philippe and his wife who had recently joined the family. To Evangeline's left would be her parents Jacques and Helene, then her two brothers Antoine and Lucien with their wives. Delphine created a physical model of the table using paper figures, practicing until she could identify each person's position instantly and without hesitation. She assigned each position a corresponding section of the cake, marking her decorative scheme so she would know at a glance which piece needed to go to which guest. The section with the largest candied rose would go to Victor, containing the highest dose calculated to ensure he suffered maximally before death. The piece decorated with gold leaf lilies would go to Augustine, his portion calibrated to account for his weight and poor health. Evangeline's section featured candied violets, her favorite, laced with enough poison to kill her within hours but calculated to account for her youth and smaller frame. Each guest had been assigned their own beautifully decorated death, personalized and precise. Beyond the technical preparations, Delphine also needed to prepare herself psychologically for what she was about to do. These were not abstract victims but real people who would die because of her actions. Some of them, like Evangeline and her family, had never directly harmed Delphine or her mother. Their crime was simply being part of the same social and economic class that had enabled Victor's violence and protected him from consequences. Tante Josephine helped her think through the moral dimensions of what she was planning during their long evenings together in the cottage by the bayou. The old woman did not sugarcoat the reality that Delphine would be committing mass murder, that she would be taking lives that included people who might be individually innocent of deliberate cruelty. But she also helped Delphine understand that justice sometimes required terrible choices, that a system built on violence and oppression would never reform itself through gentle persuasion or patient waiting. The Beaumont and Dufresne families had built their wealth through enterprises that depended on enslaved labor, had participated in and benefited from a social structure that treated people like Delphine and her mother as less than human. They had chosen to bind their families together through Victor's marriage despite what he had done, or perhaps not caring enough to find out what he had done. They would celebrate their union in a mansion built by enslaved workers, eating food prepared by enslaved cooks, served by enslaved waiters, never once considering the humanity of the people who made their luxury possible. If Delphine killed them, she would be delivering a message that would echo far beyond their individual deaths, that the oppressed would not always accept oppression silently, that violence flowed in multiple directions. Tante Josephine also helped Delphine plan her escape, because staying in New Orleans after the poisoning would guarantee capture and execution. The old woman had connections to networks of people who helped fugitives move through the South toward freedom, a loose organization that would later be called the Underground Railroad but which in 1852 operated through word of mouth, trusted contacts, and enormous personal risk. She explained that Delphine would need to disappear immediately after delivering the cake, before the symptoms began, before anyone connected the deaths to the wedding feast. She would need to have supplies packed and hidden, money saved, a route plan that avoided major roads and checkpoints. The destination would be Mexico, Tante Josephine decided, not Canada, which was farther and required passing through too many states where slave catchers operated. Mexico had abolished slavery decades earlier and had become a destination for freedom seekers who could reach its borders. The journey would be dangerous and difficult, requiring Delphine to travel alone through hostile territory where a young black woman would face constant danger from slave catchers, criminals, and authorities. But it was possible, and possible was all Delphine needed. She began preparing for the escape with the same meticulous attention she brought to every other aspect of her plan. She saved every coin she could from her sewing and baking commissions, hiding the money in a small leather pouch she wore under her clothes. She acquired men's clothing that would allow her to travel with less attention, cutting her hair short in a style that might let her pass as a young man from a distance. She studied maps that Tante Josephine obtained through her network, memorizing routes through Louisiana swamps and Texas plains, identifying places where she might find help or at least shelter. She wrote letters to Isaac and Benjamin that would be delivered after her departure, explaining what she had done and why, asking their forgiveness for leaving them, begging Isaac to keep Benjamin safe and to tell him that their mother had been loved and avenged. These letters were the hardest part of her preparation, the moment when the personal cost of her revenge became undeniable. She would lose her family, her home, everything familiar. She would become a fugitive hunted by law enforcement and possibly by private bounty hunters hired by the grieving Beaumont and Dufresne relatives. She would live the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, unable to return to New Orleans or to see her father and brother again. The price was almost unbearable, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was living with the knowledge that her mother's murderer had faced no consequences, had celebrated his wedding and lived his life as if Martha had never existed. That alternative was a different kind of death, a slow killing of the spirit that would destroy Delphine as surely as any poison. In late April, a month before the wedding, Delphine received a visit from Lisette that nearly derailed everything. The enslaved housekeeper appeared at her door in the evening looking frightened and uncertain, asking if they could speak privately. Once inside, Lisette revealed that she had been in the Beaumont mansion on the night Martha died, had been cleaning in an upstairs room when she heard the commotion on the staircase. She had not witnessed the actual fall, but she had heard the argument beforehand, had recognized the voices as belonging to Victor and Martha. She had stayed hidden after Martha's death, terrified that speaking would get her sold or killed, but the guilt had been consuming her just as it had consumed old Jerome. When she learned that Delphine would be creating the wedding cake, something about the situation had struck her as both appropriate and terrifying. She did not directly accuse Delphine of planning anything, but her words made clear that she suspected something, that she recognized the too perfect irony of the murdered woman's daughter being invited to provide food for the murderer's celebration. She asked Delphine straight out if she was planning to hurt anyone, if the cake would be safe. The question hung in the air between them, and Delphine faced a choice that could destroy everything. She could lie, deny any intentions, and hope Lisette accepted the deception. Or she could trust this woman who had clearly wrestled with her own conscience about remaining silent, who had come here knowing that even asking the question put her at risk. Delphine chose a middle path. She did not admit anything explicitly, but she asked Lisette a question in return. If someone were planning to seek justice for an unpunished murder, would Lisette feel morally obligated to protect the murderer? Would she alert the Beaumont family to potential danger, knowing it would mean protecting Victor from consequences for killing an innocent woman? Lisette sat silent for a long time, her face reflecting an internal struggle between self-preservation and something else, perhaps a sense of solidarity with other women who had suffered at the hands of men like Victor Beaumont. Finally, she spoke carefully, saying she did not want to know any details about what might or might not happen at the wedding. What she did want was to make sure she understood which food would be safe and which would not, so that she could ensure the household staff who would be serving the meal did not accidentally consume anything. Dangerous. Delphine understood immediately what Lisette was offering, a tacit alliance that would protect innocent servants while allowing whatever was going to happen to proceed without interference. She assured Lisette that only the wedding cake itself would present any danger, that everything else served at the meal would be completely safe. She explained that she would personally serve the cake only to the seated guests, that no servants should touch it or taste it under any circumstances. Lisette nodded slowly, accepting this information without asking for clarification about what exactly the danger might be. Before she left, she surprised Delphine by embracing her briefly, whispering that Martha had been kind to her during fittings, that she was sorry for not speaking up sooner, that she hoped whatever happened would bring some measure of peace. After Lisette departed, Delphine sat in her dark apartment feeling the weight of what was about to happen settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had an ally now, someone who knew enough to stop her but who had chosen not to, who had instead offered help. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that she was not just acting for herself but becoming part of a larger web of resistance and complicity, of people who chose which rules to follow and which to break based on their own moral calculations. The first week of May arrived with the oppressive heat that characterized New Orleans summers beginning to assert itself, turning the city into a steam bath that made every movement exhausting. Delphine continued her double life, accepting sewing commissions and completing them perfectly, baking cakes for various celebrations and receiving praise for her work, all while secretly preparing ingredients for a very different kind of creation. She made several trips to Bayou St. John in the pre-dawn darkness, collecting the final plants she would need. The oleander came from Tante Josephine's own garden, carefully harvested and processed to extract maximum potency. The white snakeroot she gathered from wild areas where it grew in shady spots along the water's edge, identifying it with absolute certainty before harvesting leaves and stems that she would dry and process into concentrated extract. She worked with extreme caution, wearing gloves when handling the plants and ensuring that no trace of the materials could contaminate any of her other cooking or her living space where Benjamin might accidentally encounter it. The processing happened in the hidden corner of the storage area, where she had set up a makeshift laboratory that would have looked to any observer like simply a collection of dried herbs for cooking. She created her extracts using techniques Tante Josephine had taught her, boiling plant materials in distilled water to draw out the toxic compounds, then reducing the liquid slowly over low heat until it became concentrated enough to be lethal in small doses. The work was tedious and dangerous, requiring absolute precision to achieve the right potency without creating something so obviously toxic that it would be immediately detectable. By the second week of May, with the wedding just days away, Delphine had everything ready. The poison sat in small vials hidden in her workroom, clearly labeled with Tante Josephine's careful notation system so there would be no possibility of confusion. Her escape supplies were packed and hidden, ready to be retrieved immediately after the wedding. Her letters to Isaac and Benjamin were written and entrusted to Tante Josephine, who would deliver them the day after the poisoning. The base recipe for the cake had been perfected through multiple test runs and was documented in a separate notebook that contained only innocent recipes, something that could be found after her departure without revealing anything incriminating. She had practiced the serving routine until she could do it without conscious thought, had memorized which decorated section corresponded to which guest so thoroughly that she could picture it in her dreams. Everything was ready. All that remained was to create the actual wedding cake that would deliver death to 12 people who had no idea their celebration would be their last meal. On May 13th, 2 days before the wedding, Delphine began the final preparations. She started with the cake layers themselves, baking them in her apartment's small oven in batches because she did not have professional baking equipment and could only manage 2 layers at a time. The process took most of the day, and by evening she had created 6 perfectly golden layers that filled her apartment with the warm scent of vanilla and butter, a pleasant aroma that completely disguised their eventual purpose. She let the layers cool overnight, wrapped carefully in clean cloth to preserve moisture. The next morning, May 14th, she began assembly at Tante Josephine's cottage where she had more space and privacy for the final steps that would transform a delicious cake into an instrument of death. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.